Bobbylee single-handedly destroyed the Impulsive podcast on their 351st episode with a single joke, which would eventually end the relationship between Logan, Mike, and most notably, George, Janko. The show started in late 2018 by Logan and Mike, and they were a bit of a dream team. Their egotistical personalities seemed to mesh well, and Mike's more mature outlook on life complemented Logan's more brash, youthful approach. Keeping a third member on the podcast, however, has proven to be incredibly difficult for the two. Today, Impulsive has released 417 episodes, with the first 150 featuring this guy. Spencer was a fun-loving vegan, but his time on the podcast came to an end when he spontaneously dropped the news that he was moving to Hawaii. Shortly after, Spencer was replaced by Logan's childhood friend named Mac, which was short-lived after him and Mike got into a heated exchange. On episode 219, George Janko was introduced as the third member of the podcast. Little did anyone know at the time he would be the most pivotal.
Every time I tried to say it, he said there was a live painting, and then there was Lele Pons had comments, bro. I'm sorry.
No, it's because
I just was doing it. I was just getting there, and he said he did a 24-hour painting, and the fans say they want to hear Mac.
George was able to add a completely different layer to the show, being a devout Christian and attracting a different type of audience. George also happens to be a stand-up comedian and provide comedic relief on the podcast, but ironically, his own profession would end up being the eventual demise of the show. Contrary to what some expected, George was absolutely killing it on the show, and the audience loved him. Before he was ever even an official member of the team, he subbed in for Mac when Mac couldn't make it for the 6ix9ine podcast. At the time, 6ix9ine was at the top of the world, and it was a huge opportunity for the channel, and naturally, Logan was super nervous to have George on, not knowing how he would handle the spotlight. And to everyone's surprise, George literally carried that podcast, and only 4 episodes after, he was officially added to the Impulsive team. George continued to shine episode after episode. Guests really seemed to enjoy his super likable personality, his comedic timing and relatability. Heck, even Mike seemed to love George, praising him for his contributions to the channel. Everything seemed to be going perfectly. Impulsive was bigger than ever, getting phenomenal views, the videos were received great from the audience, and for once, it seemed like everybody was getting along. Until everything changed. It seemed George didn't know how to handle his newfound popularity and the pressure got to him. This became super evident in his interview skills. He felt that anytime he opened his mouth, he would have to say something either super funny or meaningful. This caused him to overthink what he was going to say rather than just allowing the conversation to flow naturally. And when he would talk, he would come across as super insecure or needy. And because of the ridiculous expectations everyone had of him, he started to get called out by the viewers. And this stopped George from talking altogether and essentially would make him mute for the majority of the episodes. Up until this point, although there was a change in George's performance, it wasn't bad enough to cause an outrage. And for the most part, it flew under the radar. But George's insecurities were about to be exposed badly in the Shaq interview when he was forced to do the podcast in front of a live audience. After remaining pin-drop silent for the first 11 minutes of the episode, Shaq would look over to George and confront him.
Father likes.
Hold on, you ain't gonna ask me a question? Damn.
He waits. He likes to wait until.
Nah, I'm just taking.
You wear short shorts.
I'm telling you,
Jeez.
they're making a resurgence.
Shaq would continuously pick on George and embarrass him in front of everybody, putting him on the spot for the rest of the podcast. But it got really bad when Shaq insinuated they should fire him and completely destroyed George's confidence. After this complete failure of an episode, George started to feel that maybe he wasn't cut out for the role after all. I wish this is where it ended, but things were about to get 100 times worse for George Janko. When on episode 351, the legendary comedian Bobbylee himself would appear as a guest.
Go. You find him, George. No, go get him. Go get him. I said this. He walked, and that's a first. And now we're gonna have to deal with the fallout of this episode for the
Logan.
next.
And he would make one single joke that would lead to the downfall of the entire podcast. You see, this was a huge deal for George. Bobby was a great comedian, something that George was aspiring to be. So I'm sure you can imagine that George would be super nervous and would want to make a good impression on his idol. Unfortunately for George, not only did he not make a good impression, but his idol ended up bullying him for the majority of the podcast and would push George to the point where he would run off of the set and call an Uber home. The show started off relatively tame. Bobby was just being Bobby, doing what Bobby does best, shooting little shots here and there at George, which was expected. Things took a turn for the worst, however, when George took the playful shots to borderline aggression. His behavior was likely a buildup of pressure over the last few episodes, but Bobby was able to sense insecurity and decided to ramp it up a notch. But the next joke seemed to really fluster George when he spoke about his career.
For example,
Like
my
what?
career. my finances, my position in life. And when I realized that once you let it go,
which was obviously something super meaningful to him after Bobby called him out for speaking way too long, essentially discrediting everything he just said. At this point, George had had enough and really started to shell up and go into his own bubble and remain silent for the rest of the podcast, but Bobby wasn't done, and this was the exact moment when the Impulsive podcast would begin its collapse. As the pressure built up way too much, George exploded, ran off set, and took an Uber home.
He is clocked out.
I know. George has been under a tremendous amount of abuse. No, stop, George. I want you over here with me.
After the dust had settled from this explosive podcast, it seemed that George had recovered for the most part. Until shortly after, Bobby discussed what happened on his own show called The Tiger Belly with Logan Paul as the guest and roasted him again. Things were really bad, but it got even worse when just 5 episodes after Bobbylee, George and Logan got into a heated argument live on Impulsive, where Logan would attack George and say he needed a therapist because Jesus just wasn't doing it for him.
You need a therapist because Jesus isn't quite doing it for you, which is true.
No, you didn't.
Logan attempted to apologize the next episode.
From the bottom of my heart, I'm sorry.
But to be honest, it feels like he apologizes about something new every few months just to save himself from getting bashed online. George Janko likely realized that his days on the Impulsive podcast were numbered, so he created his own podcast, which started a little slow, but more recently has had Andrew Tate on, which absolutely exploded and is approaching 10 million views at this point. Then posted this to his Instagram captioned "Checkmate," taking a little shot because obviously Logan and Andrew weren't on the best terms. After George left, Impulsive really started to slow down, and so has their view count. When George was on the show, they were averaging between 1 to 2 million views a video, but now are lucky to break the 1 million mark with most of their videos sitting around 500,000. And even Logan admitted that he doesn't make any money from the channel. Logan may have mistreated George Janko on the Impulsive podcast by telling him he needs a therapist, but nothing could prepare you for the time Andrew Schultz called one of his guests on flagrant a dog. Click right here to learn more, and I'll see you guys next time.